John's deportation papers arrived during interview. His response shocked America. March 23, 1973. NBC Studios, Rockefeller Center, New York City. John Lennon was sitting under the hot lights of Studio 8H, live on national television, when a man in a government suit walked onto the set carrying an envelope. The interview stopped. The cameras kept rolling. America watched as John's face went from relaxed to pale in the space of a single heartbeat. Inside that envelope were deportation papers, final orders. John Lennon had 72 hours to leave the United States or face arrest and imprisonment. But what John did next, what he said in that moment, with 30 million Americans watching, would change everything about the government's case against him. It would expose a conspiracy that reached all the way to the White House, and it would prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't violence or protest. It's truth, spoken calmly, on live television, when they think they've already won. This is the story of how John Lennon fought the United States government on national TV and won. But more than that, it's the story of what happens when power tries to silence someone, and that someone refuses to be silent. The temperature in Studio 8H was 84 degrees. Outside, New York City was frozen in late winter cold. But inside, under the television lights, John Lennon was sweating. Not from the heat, from fear. Because 3 months earlier, he'd received a warning from someone inside the FBI. A warning that said, "They're coming for you, John, and they won't stop until you're gone." The interview had started normally. Dick Cavett, the host, was asking John about his new album, about Yoko, about life in New York City. Standard questions, safe questions. Then the studio door opened. Security didn't stop the man in the suit. That's when John knew it was official. This was the moment they'd been planning. Maximum humiliation. Maximum impact. Deport John Lennon on live television and show every other artist, every other activist, what happens when you challenge power. The man approached the desk. Dick Cavett looked confused, glancing between John and this intruder who was interrupting his show. "Mr. Lennon," the man said, his voice flat, official. "I'm with the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service. I have been instructed to serve you with these papers." He placed the envelope on the desk between John and Dick Cavett. The studio went silent. You could hear the cameras humming. 30 million people were watching this moment unfold in real time. John stared at the envelope. His hand was shaking as he reached for it. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand what led to it. John Lennon and Yoko Ono had moved to New York City in September 1971. They'd fallen in love with the city's energy, its diversity, its creative freedom. Manhattan felt like the opposite of everything London had become for them. Controlled, judgmental, suffocating. In New York, they were just two artists living in the Dakota apartment building, walking through Central Park, eating at diners, being normal. But John Lennon could never be just normal. Not when Richard Nixon was president. Not when the Vietnam War was tearing America apart. Not when young people were being sent to die in a jungle for reasons nobody could adequately explain. John started speaking out. Appearing at rallies, writing protest songs, using his fame as a platform to challenge the government's war machine. That's when the FBI started watching him. Documents that wouldn't be declassified until decades later revealed the truth. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, had personally ordered surveillance on John Lennon. The reason? John was planning a concert tour that would coincide with the 1972 presidential election, and they were terrified it would energize young voters against Nixon. Senator Strom Thurmond wrote a memo to the Attorney General that said, if Lennon's visa is terminated, it would be a strategy countermeasure. Translation? Get him out before he influences the election. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, under pressure from the White House, found their excuse. In 1968, John had been convicted in London for marijuana possession. Under U.S. immigration law, that conviction made him deportable. Never mind that the conviction was controversial. Never mind that the British courts later acknowledged the arrest had been questionable. Never mind that thousands of Americans with similar convictions weren't being deported. John Lennon was different. John Lennon was dangerous, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he represented. He represented the idea that artists don't have to stay quiet, that fame comes with responsibility, that when you see injustice, you speak up, even when speaking up costs you everything. The deportation case began in March 1972. For an entire year, John and Yoko fought it through legal channels, hiring lawyers, filing appeals, attending hearings. But by March 1973, they'd lost every appeal. The final deportation order had been signed. All that remained was serving the papers and forcing John onto a plane back to England. And the government, in their calculated cruelty, chose to do it on live television. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John opened the envelope. His hands were steady now. The initial shock had passed, replaced by something else. Something colder, more focused. Dick Cavett leaned over, trying to see what was in the envelope. John, what is that? What's happening? John pulled out the papers and read them silently. The studio was so quiet that you could hear the audience breathing. 30 million Americans were watching a man read the document that would end his American dream. When John finally looked up, his eyes weren't frightened anymore. They were angry. "Dick," John said, his Liverpool accent thicker than usual, "I've just been served with deportation papers. The United States government wants me out of the country within 72 hours. The audience gasped. Dick Cavett looked genuinely shocked. This wasn't planned. This wasn't part of the show. "But why?" Dick asked. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds," John said, his voice getting stronger, "that in 1968 I was convicted of possessing marijuana in London. That's it. That's their excuse." John held up the papers to the camera. "America, take a good look at these. This is what your government does when someone speaks truth to power. They don't debate you. They don't prove you wrong. They just try to make you disappear." The man from immigration, still standing awkwardly at the edge of the set, shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected John to be humiliated, to be broken, to leave quietly. Instead, John was fighting back, on live television, with evidence, with witnesses, with 30 million Americans watching. "Dick," John continued, "can I tell your audience something? Can I tell them what's really happening here?" "Please," Dick said. "I think America deserves to know." What John said next would be quoted in newspapers for weeks. It would be entered into congressional records. It would become evidence in lawsuits that would continue for years. This isn't about marijuana. This isn't about a 5-year-old conviction in another country. This is about silencing dissent. This is about punishing me for speaking out against the Vietnam War, for supporting peace candidates, for using my voice to say what millions of young Americans are already thinking. John looked directly into the camera. Richard Nixon is terrified of artists. He's terrified of musicians. He's terrified of anyone who can reach young people and tell them the truth about what's happening in Southeast Asia. So he's using immigration law as a weapon. If they can deport me for speaking out, they can deport anyone. The studio audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building into something that sounded like thunder. Dick Cavett, sensing he was witnessing television history, pressed forward. "John, what are you going to do? Are you going to leave?" John's answer was simple, direct, and absolutely fearless. "No." "No?" Dick repeated. "But John, these are official deportation orders. If you don't leave, you'll be arrested." "Then they'll have to arrest me on live television," John said, "because I'm not leaving. I'm not being forced out of a country I love by a government that's afraid of peace songs." The man from immigration stepped forward. "Mr. Lennon, if you refuse to comply—" "I'm not refusing to comply," John interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. "I'm exercising my legal right to appeal, and I'm doing it publicly so that everyone in America can see exactly what their government is doing." John turned back to the camera. "I want to say something to everyone watching right now, especially young people, especially students, especially anyone who's ever been told to shut up and accept things the way they are." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Don't accept it. When you see injustice, speak up. When you see your government lying to you, call them out. They have power, yes. They have courts and badges and the ability to deport people. But you know what they don't have? They don't have the truth. And in the end, truth is more powerful than all of their weapons combined. The studio audience was on their feet now. Even the crew members, who were supposed to remain neutral, were applauding. Dick Cavett, a seasoned interviewer who'd seen everything, looked genuinely moved. "John, this is extraordinary. You're essentially declaring war on the Nixon administration on national television." "I'm not declaring war," John corrected. "I'm just refusing to surrender. There's a difference." What happened in the next hour would become one of the most watched segments in television history. Dick Cavett, abandoning his planned questions, turned the show into an impromptu forum on government overreach, artistic freedom, and the right to dissent. Phone lines at NBC lit up, thousands of Americans calling in to express support for John. Lawyers offered their services pro bono. Civil rights organizations pledged assistance. But more importantly, congressmen started calling. Representatives who'd been sitting on the fence about Nixon's abuse of power suddenly had 30 million constituents watching them. The political calculus changed in real time. By the end of the show, 3 members of Congress had gone on record saying they would investigate the Immigration and Naturalization Service's handling of the Lennon case. John and Yoko left NBC studios at 11:47 p.m. Outside, in the freezing March night, hundreds of people had gathered. They'd heard what happened. They'd watched it on television, in bars, in dorm rooms, in living rooms across the city. They were there to show John he wasn't alone. The government had given John 72 hours, 3 days to pack his life, say goodbye to the city he loved, and leave America forever. John spent those 72 hours doing the opposite of what they expected. He held a press conference at the Americana Hotel. Dozens of reporters showed up, and John laid out the entire case against him. He produced documents. He showed correspondence between the FBI and immigration. He named names. Strom Thurmond, John said, holding up a memo that his lawyers had obtained through legal channels. "This senator wrote to the Attorney General specifically recommending my deportation as a countermeasure against my political activities, not because of drugs, not because of any crime, because I was speaking out against the war." The reporters scribbled frantically. This was front-page news. This was a sitting senator actively trying to silence a British musician for exercising free speech. "They thought if they served me on live television, I'd be too embarrassed to fight back," John continued. "They thought I'd just quietly leave. But I'm not embarrassed. I'm angry, and I'm going to fight this with every legal tool available." Day 2, John appeared at a rally in Washington Square Park. Thousands showed up. Students, activists, artists, ordinary New Yorkers who believed in the principle that the government shouldn't get to decide who speaks and who doesn't. Yoko stood beside him on the makeshift stage. She hadn't said much publicly since the deportation papers arrived, but now she took the microphone. "They want us divided," Scared, silent, we must not let them. The crowd roared. But what happened next showed the true power of what John and Yoko were building. A veteran in a wheelchair rolled up to the stage. He'd lost both legs in Vietnam. Security tried to stop him, but John waved them off. Let him through. The veteran made it to the stage, and John helped him up. The man took the microphone, his voice shaking. "I fought for this country," he said. "I lost my legs for this country. And I'm telling you right now, what they're doing to John Lennon is un-American. It's wrong. And if they can do it to him, they can do it to any of us." The image of John Lennon standing next to a wounded Vietnam veteran, both of them fighting the same government, was captured by every major newspaper in America. By day 3, the pressure on the Nixon administration was enormous. Editorials in major newspapers called the deportation attempt politically motivated and a violation of First Amendment principles. The American Civil Liberties Union filed an emergency appeal. Harvard law professors wrote briefs arguing that the deportation was unconstitutional. Artists from Bob Dylan to Leonard Bernstein issued statements of support. But the government didn't back down. On March 26th at 5 p.m., immigration agents arrived at the Dakota to arrest John Lennon for failure to comply with deportation orders. What they found there would change everything. When the immigration agents arrived at the Dakota, they found themselves walking into a carefully orchestrated media event. John and Yoko had invited every major news outlet in New York. ABC, CBS, NBC, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, everyone with a camera or a notepad was there. The agents stood in the lobby, uncertain. They'd been told to arrest John Lennon quietly, efficiently. Instead, they were surrounded by dozens of reporters and photographers. John appeared at the top of the stairs, calm, composed, dressed in a simple black suit. "Gentlemen," he called down, "are you here to arrest me?" The lead agent, a man named Robert Michaels, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Lennon, we have orders." "I know what your orders are," John interrupted. "You're supposed to take me into custody and put me on a plane to London. But here's the thing, I'm not resisting. I'm just insisting that if you're going to do this, you do it in front of these cameras, in front of America." John descended the stairs slowly. "Because I want everyone to see what happens when a government is so threatened by peace songs that they have to deport the person singing them." Agent Michaels looked at his partner. This wasn't in their training manual. How do you forcibly remove someone who's not actually resisting, but also not cooperating? How do you do it with 50 cameras recording your every move? "Mr. Lennon," Michaels tried again. "If you don't come voluntarily, I am coming voluntarily," John said. "I'm just doing it publicly." "Is that a problem?" The standoff lasted 20 minutes. The agents called their superiors. Their superiors called the White House. And somewhere in those marble corridors of power, someone made a calculation. The optics were terrible. A man in handcuffs, surrounded by cameras, being dragged out of his home for singing peace songs. That wasn't the image the Nixon administration needed 3 months into his second term. The phone call came at 5:47 p.m. Agent Michaels listened, his face unreadable. When he hung up, he turned to John. "Mr. Lennon, I've been instructed to inform you that your deportation has been temporarily stayed pending further review." The lobby erupted. Reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. Yoko threw her arms around John, but John just stood there, looking at Agent Michaels with something like sympathy. "You're just doing your job," John said quietly. "I know that, but maybe it's worth asking who benefits from that job." Agent Michaels didn't respond. He and his partner left quietly, walking past the cameras that had captured their retreat. The victory was temporary. Everyone knew that. The deportation case would continue for 4 more years, through appeals and hearings and legal battles that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. But something fundamental had changed. John Lennon had proven that you could fight power without violence. That transparency was a weapon more powerful than any gun. And more importantly, he'd shown 30 million Americans that their government was more fragile than it appeared, that it could be challenged, that it could be held accountable. The New York Times headline the next morning read, "Lennon deportation stayed after media confrontation." But the story that ran underneath told a deeper truth. Nixon administration backs down in face of public scrutiny. The deportation case dragged on until 1976. 3 more years of hearings, appeals, uncertainty. But in those 3 years, something remarkable happened. The case became bigger than John Lennon. It became a symbol of government overreach, of political persecution, of the danger that happens when leaders use law enforcement as a weapon against dissent. Documents emerged showing that the FBI had wiretapped John's phone, that they'd infiltrated peace groups he was associated with, that they'd coordinated with immigration to time the deportation papers for maximum political impact. Each revelation made the government's case weaker. Each document proved what John had said on live television that March night. This wasn't about marijuana. It was about silencing a voice. On October 7, 1975, the U.S. Court of Appeals overturned John's deportation order. The ruling was scathing. It stated that the government had engaged in selective prosecution and had violated John's First Amendment rights. John was granted his green card on July 27, 1976. The ceremony was held at the INS office in New York, the same office that had tried to deport him 4 years earlier. The officer who processed his green card was Robert Michaels, the same agent who'd been sent to arrest him that day at the Dakota. "Mr. Lennon," Michaels said as he handed over the green card, "for what it's worth, I'm glad this is how it ended." John took the card, studying it like it was the most precious thing he'd ever held. "Me too. And Robert, thank you for being kind that day. You didn't have to be." The two men shook hands. A government agent and the artist he'd been ordered to arrest, finding common ground in the recognition that they were both just humans trying to do the right thing in a complicated world. When John emerged from the INS office, reporters were waiting. Always reporters, even 4 years later. "John, how does it feel to finally win?" John thought about it for a moment. "It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like surviving. Like we all survived something that tried to break us." "Do you regret speaking out, knowing what it cost you?" "Not for a second," John said immediately. "If anything, I regret not speaking out more, because here's what I learned from all this. Power is terrified of truth, not violence, not protest. Truth. The simple act of standing up on television and saying, 'This is wrong,' scared them more than any riot ever could." He paused, looking at the green card in his hand. This little piece of plastic took 4 years to get. 4 years of fear and stress and uncertainty. But you know what? It was worth it. Because 30 million people watched the government try to silence someone and fail. That matters. That changes things. The footage of John receiving his green card was broadcast that night on every major network. But the more powerful image was what came after. John and Yoko walking through Central Park, hand in hand. Just 2 people enjoying a summer evening in the city they loved. Free, safe, home. John Lennon lived in New York for 4 more years. On December 8, 1980, he was murdered outside the Dakota by a disturbed fan. But in those final 4 years, he'd accomplished something that outlived him. He'd proven that artists don't have to be silent, that governments can be challenged, that truth, spoken courageously, can defeat power. The deportation case changed American law. It established precedents about political persecution, about selective prosecution, about the limits of government power. But more than legal precedents, it changed culture. It showed a generation that resistance wasn't futile, that speaking up mattered, that one person, armed with nothing but truth and a microphone, could face down the entire apparatus of government power and win. Years later, in documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests, the full scope of the government's campaign against John was revealed. The wiretaps, the surveillance, the coordination between FBI, INS, and the White House. It was everything John had said it was. He'd been right all along. The envelope that was delivered on live television that March night in 1973 was meant to end John Lennon's American story. Instead, it began something more powerful. A reminder that freedom isn't free, that rights have to be defended, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to be silent. Today, there's a memorial in Central Park called Strawberry Fields. Thousands visit it every year to remember John Lennon, the musician, the dreamer, the peace activist. But what they should also remember is John Lennon, the fighter, the man who was served deportation papers on live television and chose to fight back with truth instead of fear. The government gave John 72 hours to leave America. He stayed for 7 more years, and in those years, he proved something that power never wanted us to know. They're more afraid of us than we should ever be of them. The envelope contained deportation papers, but what John Lennon created in response contained something more powerful: hope, courage, the understanding that one voice speaking truth can change the world. How many envelopes have been delivered to your door? How many times has power tried to silence you, intimidate you, make you comply? And how many times have you fought back? John Lennon showed us that the answer to fear isn't more fear. It's truth, spoken clearly, on live television, with 30 million witnesses. Some revolutions happen with guns, some happen with votes, and some happen when one man refuses to leave, refuses to be silent, and forces an entire nation to watch as justice slowly, painfully, finally prevails.